covered now with lines and creases, tickets torn in half, memories in bits and pieces, traces of...
Hi, I'm Jim Campano of the West Ender, and this is Alan Lupo, a Globe columnist. Alan Lupo has been known as the champion of the little man, and he's written a book, Liberty's Chosen Home, and he's just had it re-released. This is Raymond Papa, publisher of the West End.
Thank you. We'd like to say that this show is dedicated to Charlie Papa, who was my father. Most of you are aware of that. Owned a bar on Leverett Street. And it was frequented by many and many West Enders. So this show is really dedicated to him. Thank you.
Okay. In Liberty's Chosen Home, right, you started off, you said that you wrote a chapter about the West End. When did the West End first come to your attention, and why did you write that little chapter?
Well, growing up around here, I always assumed there would always be a West End, so I never paid much attention to it, just as you assumed there'd always be a South End, too, by the way, or an Italian North End, which hardly exists anymore.
Right.
But I was a reporter out of state during the time that the heavy stuff was happening in the West End. When I got back to Massachusetts, it was 1966, and I joined the Globe. I left the Baltimore Sun to join the Globe. And my wife, pregnant, and I, not pregnant, went to look for a place to live. So we went around and we saw this big high-rise apartment house. And we said, well, this looks convenient, we'll walk in there. It was 1966, and they were charging $300 million a square foot. And we said, thank you very much. And I said, what is this? And my dad said, this was the West End.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you've got to be kidding.
Mm-hmm.
How did this happen? And one of the first things I did at the Globe was run a neighborhood series in 1967 when Kevin White was first running for mayor. And we had an urban team. We ran a series in all the neighborhoods in Boston. It's the first one they ever did on it. And I remember wandering through the few tenements that were left in the West End. And I found an elderly couple. And they were having, I guess, lunch. And she wasn't eating at all. And he was eating a piece of bread and some beans. And they began talking about their life there and how it had changed. And after that, I couldn't ever lose my interest in the rape of that neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Well, the West End was a multi-ethnical neighborhood, and there also was the New York streets that was a similar type area.
In the South End.
Right. Do you think that that had something to do with it because they were multi-ethnical? In other words, they didn't have sort of, we'll say, the politicians really didn't take them serious? Or?
I don't think it was because there was integration in the neighborhoods that the Pauls didn't take it seriously. I think it's because they didn't have, first of all, they were tenements, which is not to say they were slums. They were two of the oldest neighborhoods in the city.
Mm-hmm.
It was easier to get at them.
Mm-hmm.
It was easier to raise them.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have the political clout. The South End never had much political clout.
Mm-hmm.
And after Lemazny and John I. Fitzgerald, the West End didn't have much political clout. And it was a different kind of city council, remember. Once upon a time, there was a city council law representing each neighborhood. There were 22 of them. And by this time that you're referring to, there was an at-large city council, which was supposed to represent citywide issues and progress. So it was much easier to take on a neighborhood like the West End with that kind of a system than it had been in the old days.
You know, just recently, you wrote, about 6 months ago, you wrote an article about Charles River Park, and in it, where the neighbors had ripped, former West Enders are trying to get back to the land down Lowell Square, and they had called us misfits, and that if we got back, that they'd have an instant slum. And you wrote an article right after that, and you took them apart. Okay, you really did, you did a column on them. I was wondering why you wrote that. Did you perceive it as an ongoing injustice, or was it just something that came out?
It was both. I mean, it was something that really needed to be written about, and it is an ongoing injustice. It's part of a larger story that you've been telling. These people had no right to engage in that kind of class warfare. I mean, who are they to decide that a person, because that person might be low income or poor or a working stiff, is going to turn a neighborhood into a slum area? It was as ridiculous as the original presumption as to why the West End had to be raised. There were indeed slum properties in the West End, nobody would deny that. But most of them were not slums, And there was this foolish notion in the 50s that if it was an old neighborhood that had tenements or 3 deckers, therefore it wasn't any good. Well, now you have again this thing happening in the 80s, where people living in those sterile apartments, which they called home, some of them soon to be condos, say, well, we don't want to destroy our quality of life. That's foolish. Their quality of life would not be affected one iota.
Matter of fact, those condos are, from what I understand, the plumbing and everything electrical work is really old now. It's like 30 years later. And he's selling them the condos, okay? And they, in effect, after they buy the condos, in other words, they'll be paying for all the electrical and plumbing repairs. So he stands to make out on both ends.
This could be. I haven't looked into that. But what really bothers me is that the city has been unable to claim that one small piece of leftover land. I mean, just for a sense of justice, it belongs to the city, and it belongs for people who can't afford housing. Not just for former West Enders. I wouldn't limit it to former West Enders, but certainly including former West Enders. The justice should be delayed for so long is horrendous enough. That it should be denied altogether is unconscionable. And that's what's happened so far. You know what it reminds me of? It's like television, like what we're doing now. No, really, you look at it. Now, I don't want anyone to stare at me back at home because it's kind of a frightening thing, but I haven't shaved since 6 o'clock in the morning, all right? I look like Richard Nixon did in that 1960 debate. And now you can understand why he may have lost it. My tie is down because I don't buy the right size shirt collars, and people are going to look at me, I'm a little portly, to put it politely, and my hair isn't combed the way it should be, and people are going to look and they're going to say, gee, that's kind of frightening. I'm sure I want my child to look at this thing. But the reality is, I'm not that bad a person, I'm not a frightening person, and I'm certainly not a tough person. So it was like the West End, it was like television. You see, it was cosmetics. You looked at it, and if you were used to 1950s suburbia, you said, wow, that's a tough place, that's an ugly place. No, I wouldn't want anyone to live there, and I think we ought to tear it down. And then you look at what replaced, and you say, well, that's much nicer. In fact, it isn't nicer. In fact, the old place had the soul.
Right, it did. Especially some of those places, like you went down Spring Street on a Saturday. It reminded me a lot of, I don't know, I was never there, but, from what I've heard of, like, Delancey Street and all those streets in New York. Spring Street was our, shopping area, and other bush cats out there and everything. There was life, there was...
That's the key. That's the key, life. You see, a lot of places in the city, they now get deserted. By 4 or 5 in the afternoon, they're deserted. And they're make-believe neighborhoods. And you can't call it a safe neighborhood, if that's how it's going to be, and you certainly can't call it a lively neighborhood. And that's the beauty of places where there's people out in the corners and people on the street and movement up and down the sidewalks and on the stoops, yeah.
Well, there were people 24 hours a day, you walk the streets, nobody ever bothered you.
That's right.
It was really, really
It was
great.
it was a safe place. Well, television helped kill it. Here we are sitting on television, and it's, and it's really probably not a polite thing to say, but television did help kill it. You remember, there was a great change, I'd say by the early 50s. You'd be out in the street, in my case it was Winthrop, we'd be out in the street playing, the adults would be sitting on the stoop, they'd be on the steps watching, make sure no strangers came down the street, make sure that everything was cool and safe, and make sure their own kids didn't create too many problems. All of a sudden, fewer and fewer adults were outside, listening to the ball game, or having a beer, reading the paper, or talking to one another. They were heading inside, into the apartments, or if they own homes, into their homes. What were they doing there? They were watching Hopalong Cassidy. They were watching Howdy Doody. I mean, you had grown people watching this stuff.
Guiding Light.
Guiding Light.
Mustn't forget, the Guiding Light.
It changed the whole era.
It did. And it did not change neighborhood life for the better, because as a kid, and I was a teenager and adolescent, I said, this is terrific. They just gave us the streets. The adults gave the streets to the kids. Now, what are we going to do? We're going to tear them apart is what we're going to do, because nobody's going to tell us any different.
That's right. In the old days, like in the West End, you couldn't move. When you went from one area of the West End to another, somebody still knew you. In other words, you had to go outside of the West End. If you were going to do anything bad, you had to leave.
Yeah.
Okay.
Neighborhood radar.
Right. And
Yeah.
if you stood there and you did something to West Enders inside the West End, you were ostracized. In other words, that was it. You were gone. Nobody would talk to you. You couldn't participate in anything, and that was the end of it.
You could be 6, 7 streets away from my neighborhood, and I would get a message
Right,
that my mother was looking for me.
exactly.
And I didn't get the message because I heard my mother, and nobody placed a phone call, and there weren't any personal computers. It was done through the chain of command, street to street, neighbor to neighbor.
Where are you?
By the time I got that message, she was not only looking for me, she was looking for me, shall we say, with gusto.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, I lived in the West. I was evicted 3 times, and I think about this.
Was that your personal habits?
Oh, but I got evicted 3 times. You know, the first time, we lived on Minot Street. And I'll never forget this, Minot Street. We got evicted because they were building the Distress Way, Expressway, whatever you want to call it, this new thing that make cars, people get around easier. And we moved, it was Columbus Day, we moved by push cart. I mean, we had plenty of money, we were loaded people, you can tell, push carts. And it was on Chambers Street, we got evicted off of Chambers Street. I mean, now I finally get a chance to go back to the West End, I'm on Billerica Street, I'm happy. This is in the 70s, I'm happy, I'm living there, beautiful. Up comes eminent domain again, boom, they grab the house, there's nothing to do, you go. The day I moved, the day the building went down. But now what they do, fortunately, like I say, for this Senator Brooks, when he was a senator, and the days when we were evicted, nobody got anything. Nobody, very few people got money out of it. But he had passed a bill due to this urban eminent domain where people did get money. And I, for one, as a tenant, I received $8,700 when I was politely asked to leave Billerica Street.
Nobody else knew that.
Do I know anybody money?
But, you know, even giving people money doesn't answer.
No,
It doesn't answer. Once you destroy a neighborhood,
Yeah.
and that's gone forever. You can't ever recreate that. Even if a bunch of West Enders move back to that
Right. No.
housing that may someday get built, you
Right.
can't ever recreate
The
that.
night Ritter service called us up when we had our first reunion, and they wanted to know how we could get 1,500 people into a hall 30 years after the fact. Okay, they couldn't believe, they said this happened in New York, happened in Chicago, happened in the Bronx, and they named about 5 or 6 other places where urban renewal and eminent domain was put into effect. And 30 years later, we're still together, and, you know, it seems like all the rest of these people have just dissipated.
No, that really is strange, and you know, who knows how long even that will last. Is your children, will your children all get together? I'm sure they all get along when they meet one another, but they don't share the same
No.
history.
The values are.
And that's what makes it difficult.
Mm.
But the interesting thing in my mind about the West End, and in addition to what we've been talking about, is that was a lesson for everybody.
Right.
The refugees, you guys were refugees, you know? You may not have been displaced, but you were displaced, but you like DPs, you were refugees. And wherever you went, you carried a message to be careful of urban renewal. Urban renewal could be very good, but your presence in whatever neighborhood you moved into, in or out of the city, there was a message there that said urban renewal could also be very bad. And other kinds of projects can be bad. And around the same time this was happening, they were expanding Logan Airport into East Boston and Winthrop and that area, and people were beginning to have doubts about that. They were coming up with these cockamamie highway plans that were gonna shoot through the southern part of the city and the northern part of the city and tear up city and suburb. So by the mid-60s, people had learned from your experience in the West End and knew that they could stand up and they could fight this stuff. They didn't have to take it. Somebody drives a bulldozer through your living room, you got the right to say, excuse me, you know, pardon me, but why are you here?
Well, I know Charlestown was one of the first, after they had seen what happened to the West End, they really got up in arms, and they stood by their properties, and they stuck together in Charlestown. They wanted to get urban renewal in there, they really wanted part of Charlestown. And the people themselves really regrouped and held tight. South End, yeah.
Something was slated. They were slated, and they fought in Austin, parts of Austin. I forgot the section now, but I think it was down by the railroads. They were set to go.
And what they learned to do is they learned to negotiate with the people. It didn't mean that anybody got his or her own way, but it did mean there'd be a happy meeting.
See, we didn't have that one of it. We were just, you know, hey, what are you doing here? Like I said, you sit in the sidewalk, the building goes down. You never knew what was gonna happen.
That's right.
And it happened so fast.
Yeah, they came in quick. As soon as
Really quick.
they passed, see, they couldn't do it in '54 when they originally made the plan, because eminent domain was never used before to take buildings, private property, for use for a private contractor or private use. It always had to be taken for the public good, a schoolyard, a road, you know, that type of thing, post office. So it went through the Supreme Court, and in 1958, in April of 1958, the Supreme Court ruled that they could use eminent domain to take private property and use it for private purposes. in May, the cranes and bulldozers were pulling into the West End, and it was coming down.
Mhm.
So they really, and everybody thought it wouldn't happen, so everybody was sitting back, and it just sort of.
Oh, that was quick, like an overnight
They came
thing.
in, within 3 weeks, they had like 3 blocks down.
Look at the changes now, though. The change happens in a different way now. Now the neighborhoods in and out of Boston change, but not the same way.
Right.
And right here in Somerville,
Mhm.
in Cambridge,
Right.
in the North End, in Dorchester, it's a whole new situation.
Exactly.
It's a class situation. People
It
with
is.
money,
Exactly.
who have a right to live too, are moving in, but what does that do to the property values? Of course, it
Brings
boosts
them
them
up,
up, and the average working stiff or the subsidized tenant or the elderly person is running scared in a lot of these places because of gentrification.
Exactly. North End is only 17% Italian at this point.
Yeah, where do those figures come from? Do you know offhand?
I've gotten them from somebody down the
Yeah.
North End, and
I know it was below 50%.
They had
I
a
don't know.
program on last night about the North End. It was pretty interesting. I watched it, Saturday night or whatever night it was.
Charlestown is only 46% towny. I got that out of, I think, the Charlestown Ledger.
Yeah.
I believe that was the
Yeah.
top
Times have changed. See,
economic.
the North End people have moved out because, at the time when they're selling the building, nobody knew the property was gonna skyrocket a few years back. I mean, someone could have said, we give you $150,000 for your house. You paid $5,000. Hey, look at the profit, you sell it. These people come in, they make condos. 80%, if you look at the North End, I'd say 60% is condos.
Oh, yeah, that's
I mean, it's ridiculous.
That's
The
right.
people that want to stay there can't stay there. There's no way for them to stay. They can't afford the ridiculous rents, they can't afford the condos.
You know, the great irony of that is that a lot of people began moving into the North End, new people, non-Italian people, began moving into the North End in the late 60s, and they said the reason they wanted to move in there was because it was safe. Well, more and more of them moved in, and the more of the guys who theoretically could protect you moved out.
Yeah.
And now I'm hoping it's still safe, but I wouldn't bet that it's as safe as it
I've been
was.
down there for years.
I think crime in the streets is still relatively safe, but the break-in rate has gone up
It's gone
considerably.
up. That's
Yeah.
true. That's
It
true.
really has.
That's another thing that's done a number. Drugs have done a number on most of the neighborhoods, and it's interesting to speculate whether drugs would have done a number on the West End had the West
I'm
End
sure
been
it would have.
allowed to.
I'm sure. it would.
No question
you know,
about it.
no
The
question.
thing is, we say to ourselves, Jimmy and I sit down now and then and say, what would we have been today if the West End was still standing? Would we be alive, or would we be involved with selling drugs? Would we be into drugs? You'll never have the answer to that. It's something to think about. What would we be? I really don't know. I would imagine the West End would be like anywhere else.
I'm sure-
Drugs,
Yeah.
no question
I'm
about it.
sure the West End would have been gentrified too. I'm sure because it was the ideal spot. And some of those buildings were beautiful. As you can see some of these pictures.
Oh, the architectural work was
Those
great.
streets were some of those were the oldest streets in Boston.
Mhm.
There's like 2 or 3 of them that date back to the early 1700s, and the buildings were really good, slate roofs and the whole bit. But it would have been the north slope of Beacon Hill has the same exact housing stock as the West End. Okay. But the reason that they didn't cross Cambridge Street, okay, there was in a report at that time, it said that while the north slope of Beacon Hill is made up mainly of Northern European mercantile and office workers, across the street, large families of Italians and Jews.
Right, right.
You know,
I'm gonna watch those large families of
Right, so that's-
hyphenated Americans. You never know what they're gonna do.
So that was, that shows you a little bit of the way they were thinking at that time.
Right, well, it comes back to the way people perceive class and the way they perceive the way you live. And I moved back to the community that I left, and that was considered a strange thing to do. People who grew up with me say, "You're still there?" I said, "No, I'm not still there. I've lived in New York, I've lived in Fort Knox because the government wanted me to. I've lived in Europe and such. I moved back because I wanted to, because it's a neighborhood."
Okay, Raymond, would you give some community news?
Sure.
Sorry, Alan.
Oh, so, no, that's all right, that's important
Absolutely.
stuff.
All right, there's a little community news here. We got coming up at the West End Branch Library on 151 Cambridge Street, Boston. It's going to be the reminiscence of the old West End of Boston, a special lecture by Joseph Caruso, author and painter. This is going to be held Thursday evening, October 20th at 6:45. Memories of growing up in one of Boston's ethnic neighborhoods include learning how to hustle, hawk, and fight, as well as impressions of a great variety of people such as fishermen, street peddlers, and bookies. This is news from St. Joseph Church. The 200th anniversary of the first public Catholic Mass in Boston will be celebrated at St. Joseph's Church in the West End on Sunday, October 30th at 11:30. Bishop Robert Banks, D.D., will be the principal celebrant of the Pontifical Mass in commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the first public Mass offered in Boston in the West End in 1788. 200 years ago, Abbé de la Portier came ashore from a French frigate which had come into Boston harbor with the captain. He was invited by a French merchant, M. Bourret, who lived on Green Street in the West End of Boston, to offer Mass on Sunday, October 19th and 26th in the home of M. Bourret. This was the first public Mass of which we have record to be offered in Boston, and it was done in the West End of the city. We do have some notices of some other occasions in which the Mass was offered secretly, but this is the first public record with the acceptance of the authorities of the city. I figured this priest types up tough. On Sunday, October 30th, West Enders who have taken a special part in the renovation and restoration of St. Joseph's Church are invited to join Bishop Banks to offer the Mass and thanksgiving for the blessings of the first Mass to be offered in St. Joseph's Parish. For Green Street and from Green Street and directly in front of the front door of the present church, a light repast will be provided for the guests after Mass in the parish hall, an opportunity to oralize. If you plan to come, please call St. Joseph's Church at this number 523-4342 in order that provisions may be made for the reception. Parking will be around the church and the public streets. Thank you.
Would you like to introduce the tape? We have a couple minutes of tape from the reunion.
Oh, yes, we have a couple of minutes of tape on our last reunion, which was held this past October 8th, I believe, or 9th?
No.
October 9th at the Wonderland Ballroom. This is the 1988 West End reunion.
Nice, right? Stanley, for the 2 years you missed the camera, he's making up for it.
Oh yeah, I'll be on that video. Who's recording?
I didn't know you were the wealthy. I can't talk. You look so good. You got married too. Yeah, what did you? Congratulations. I'm only 59.
How are you?
I don't like tonight.
Where you belong? What the hell? I want you to tell me, give me some memories of the good old West End.
Hi, well, we're back now, and we'd like to say a few words about Alan's book, Liberty's Chosen Home. It's a very good book, and it was done about busing. It pertains mostly to busing, but it was a very good book. And how did you get all the facts and figures in there?
What happened here, this was the second of 3 books, and it's not only about busing, it's a history of the city. In
Right.
fact, I'll tout it a little bit if you don't mind.
Sure, I guess.
It's maybe the first readable history of the city of Boston, and it's been published again. It first came out 10 years ago, and it's been published again with a new chapter on the back that takes you all the way up to date to about 1987 or 88. And Liberty's Chosen Home comes from a poem that Whittier delivered in 1880 at a celebration. And I've used it because it's ironic, because this city is not necessarily Liberty's chosen home. We've had a lot of problems here, and a lot of lack of liberty sometimes. And we've had a lot of problems among different ethnic groups and racial groups, and that's what this book is in part about. It talks about the Irish riots in the North End in 1863, which you don't read about in school. It talks about the Italians in Italy and what they were going through with the lack of any ability to make a living because the farmland was so rotten and because they couldn't own any property.
Exactly.
It talks about the Jews in the Pale of Settlement in Russia and how they were trying to get out. It talks about the Irish building political power in the precincts and how they reacted to these people coming in. And it talks, of course, about busing day by day. And one of the interesting things, I hope it's interesting, is that Kevin White, former mayor, gave me total access to anything that was going on in the back rooms where they were having the day-to-day meetings on busing and on the crisis in the city. Everything was open to me. And that included meetings out in the neighborhoods and in the police department and wherever.
The one thing that amazed me was when, in one of those backroom meetings they had in the book, and where he says, "I don't give a damn about anybody's rights." He says, "We'll arrest them and we'll."
He was worried. He was worried. This
Yeah.
was he was worried about white youths in Southie, especially congregating on the corners.
Right.
And there was a big discussion in City Hall, and everybody around the mayor, white and black, said, "You got to be careful. You know, we may not be able to arrest people for loitering. We may have to. They've got their constitutional rights." And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting, he said, "This city is falling apart, and I want those corners swept." Well, they were never quite swept the way he wanted them swept. But his instincts were right. I don't know what kind of constitutional grounds he stood on, but his instincts were right, because it did get, as you know, it got out of hand.
It did, exactly, yeah.
And it's interesting to work on a book like this, because you come back 10 years later, and one of the last chapters in this book takes place in Charlestown in 1975 during the busing. And it leads off with the people saying the rosary, the mothers of the kids saying the rosary, just before they charged up the hill at the top. And it was a frightening thing to be a cop that day, because here came these women mainly,
Yeah, right.
having said the rosary.
It was very frightening to be a cop in those days anyway, because I remember in those days, okay, I knew people in Charlestown, and what they were doing, they were setting up, the cops were coming down on motorcycles, and after the first 2 times they came on motorcycles, they did like the old cowboys. They set up chains across the street, and they come down on the motorcycles, and they'd yank them, and they'd take them right off the
Oh, yeah,
bikes.
it was frightening. They were throwing firecrackers at the Mounties, you know, and
The horses, sure.
And so it got pretty scary. And after that chapter, in what we call the epilogue, the very last, the new chapter, I also start off in Charlestown. But this time, I'm in a townhouse. There are 8 couples. We're having wine. We're having asparagus soup. You know, it's all of a sudden the yuppies are there, and I'm with them. And only 2 of the 8 people are Irish. And one of them is part English, part German. I know that because she's my wife. And both of them are married to Jewish guys. And hardly anybody, and none of them grew up in Charlestown. And that was the symbol of the difference of what went on right a block away from the Bunker Hill projects.
Oh, yeah.
So we talk about the kind of change that's gone on in this city. That was a symbol of it. And who knows where it's leading? We don't know. Part of it will depend on the economy. Part of it will depend on Ray Flynn's attempts to preserve some quality of neighborhood life for the people who are already there.
Ray Flynn, out of all the mayors since '58, has been the only one that has ever really gone to bat for West End people. You know, he seems, not totally, but he's at least made the first two or three footsteps. Okay?
They seem to be making the fight. I give White credit because back in those days, they were fighting for the subsidized housing for the elderly, which, as I recall, Mr. Rappaport did not want. And I do recall the city and
Right,
state
exactly.
shoving it down his throat, more or less.
We'll have a little more discussion on Mayor Flynn, I believe, if we have another, when and if we have
Okay,
another time.
before we end this, Alan, people in the West End said that you should be a West Ender, so we're gonna make you an
Honorary West End, well, thank you very much.
We're gonna give you an Urban Village
I
t-shirt.
appreciate this.
I love it.
I see, was this extra large?
We're in a good health.
Thank you very much.
And wear that especially when you're gonna meet Jerry
And
Rappaport
thank,
face
oh
to
yeah,
face.
this is very big. And thank the West Enders for
I
me,
think
too.
we're just about out of time, so we'd like to thank everybody that's watching, and that's
Till
about
next
it.
time.
And next time, if we do it again, that's about it for us, I guess.
Thank you very much. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
You'll find a trace of love still there.